being away from you for almost a year. It's great to see your faces again. Let me just direct your attention to Romans chapter 8 and verse 32, where the Apostle Paul says, "He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things?" Service began this morning with a singing of that rightly famous 23rd Psalm. You'll know how it begins. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And remember how the psalm conjures up for us those wonderful pictures in our mind of green pastures and still waters and so on. The psalm is a gem, and its brilliance has been recognized by every generation of believers since it was first penned. And yet Paul's statement here in Romans 8:32 adds to the brilliance of what David says to us in Psalm 23. And it says to us, if you want the clearest and the most compelling view of the fact that you will never want again, that you'll never know any lack of anything you need, then you don't find it in the place of still waters and green pastures. You find it in the midst of a noisy, clamoring mob. You find it in the midst of a noisy mob gathered outside the city walls of Jerusalem, and amongst the mocking priests and the grief-stricken women and the confused disciples. You'll find it amongst indifferent soldiers and their writhing victims, and the fearful darkness and the shaking earth. There you will find the truth that you will never lack anything if you are his. Or as Paul puts it here in this verse, he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him give us all things? And I so much want that be impressed upon our hearts and minds today, this morning. I want you to see, first of all, here, the costliness of God's love. The costliness of God's love. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all. It's easy for us to slip into the mistake of thinking that Calvary cost the Father nothing. Sometimes in our thinking, the gospel can be skewed and perverted so that it runs something like this. Well, God's wrath and God's judgment hangs over human sin, but that judgment fell upon Jesus and he suffers it for us. God inflicted the judgment upon Jesus who stood in the place for you. Now that's true, but it can become twisted in our thinking, and it can become something like this. Jesus is nice. Look at what he did for you. God is nasty. Look at what he put Jesus through. But that is not the gospel. What we see at Calvary is not Jesus placating the anger of a father who's unwilling to forgive us, Jesus unhappy with the Father's bad attitude towards sinners, so standing in their place instead, suffering in their stead the angry impulses of the Father. No, in the gospel, and especially at Calvary, we see the costliness of God's love. He who did not spare even his own son. You dare not think that Calvary cost God the Father nothing. In fact, it seems clear that Paul wants to stress that fact in the choice of the verb to spare. He did not spare his own son. The verb Paul uses there is the verb used by the Greek translators of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's called the Septuagint. About 200 years before Christ, they translated the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. And in that translation, they used this very same verb in Genesis chapter 22, verses 14 and 16. And if you remember Genesis 22 recounts that incident when God tested Abraham and told him that he was to offer up his only son Isaac as a burnt sacrifice. And you'll remember that Abraham went through with that, right up to the point of actually offering Isaac on the altar when God stepped in and stopped him, and so on. And in Genesis 22, verse 12, God says to Abraham, "Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Since you have not spared, withheld your only son from me." It's the same verb. Abraham did not spare Isaac. He would go that far. And here is God who did not spare his own son. It's as if Paul puts that like a mental trip for us to make us stop and to think about Genesis 22. That cost Abraham something. I know that the writer of Genesis 22 doesn't make a big point of that. He doesn't spend any time telling us how Abraham felt on that occasion in Genesis 22. It doesn't matter, you see, how Abraham felt about it. What matters is that Abraham obeyed God. He did what God told him to do. So the writer doesn't spill all of Abraham's psychological angst over the page of Genesis 22 just to drive us to tears of sympathy with him. He ignores that element of the story. But you don't think, do you, that those events, actually you don't. You don't think that that day was just any routine old day for Abraham. You don't think that the whole incident didn't wreck him, do you? Of course it did. And when we read that God did not spare his own son, you don't think that was a routine day for God, do you? That it was just another part of another day of overseeing the affairs of the universe? You don't think that when Jesus says the Father loves the Son, that he wants us to think that the Father is unmoved by the sufferings of his Son, that it didn't cost him anything to not spare his Son for us? Stories told of a young girl whose mother's hands were scarred and ugly, and while all her friends at school had mothers whose hands were soft and smooth, and she didn't say anything about it for years, and yet she was so often embarrassed by her mum. And time passed on, and she became ashamed of her mother's hands. And one day she just came out with it and told her mother and asked her mother, "Why do you have such ugly hands when all the other mothers have such pretty?" So her mother sat her down and said, "Well, dear, it's like this. When you were still a babe, when you were still sleeping in the cot at home, we had a fire in the house. And I went in to save you from the fire. And I wrapped you up in a blanket, and I ran through the fire. And my hands were burned in the fire. That's why my hands are not like the hands of other mothers in the school." And it was like a little light went on in that girl's mind. And she grabbed her mum's hands and pushed them to her cheeks and says, "Oh, Mum, I love these hands." It's not that she gave her hands, but she did not spare her hands. Now, that's just an illustration of the costliness of love. But that isn't anywhere near like the cost of God the Father when he did not spare, but gave up his only Son. You see, there's a marked difference here, isn't there, between the living God and Abraham, because in Genesis 22, God did not allow Abraham to go through with the act. He stopped him. So there's a sense in which Abraham didn't spare his son, in that he was willing to go all the way, if need be, but God stopped him. God refused to allow him to do it. But what God refused Abraham to do, he himself did, in that he did not spare his only son. And if that's true, if God's love is that costly, then don't you, Christian believer this morning, have to say, that what he says in verse 31 must be true. Surely God is for us. And if that's true, who can be against us? Then secondly, not only the costliness of God's love, but there's also the mystery of God's ways. The mystery of God's ways. And you see that in the next line. He who spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all. Delivered him up for us all. Handed him over, we might translate it. There's the mystery. How is that a mystery? Because the same verb is used in other texts of the New Testament in which God is not doing the handing over. The verb is that Paul uses here, delivered, handed over, is a word that is sometimes translated betrayed, depending on the context. Sometimes it's translated handed over or to give up. Hand over is a fairly literal translation of the Greek word here. It's a rough idea of the meaning. For example, towards the end of Mark's Gospel, we have his account of the sufferings and the death of Jesus, and this verb appears 3 times in those chapters. Mark 14, verse 18, Judas went to the chief priests to betray him to them. Mark 15, verse 1, the chief priests, in consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, delivered him to Pilate. Mark 15, verse 15, Pilate delivered Jesus to be crucified. And then our text, he delivered him up for us all. But God is doing the handing over. It's the same Greek verb, and it's interesting how the same language can carry a different connotation, isn't it? When I was a young man, there was a well-known Anglican vicar in York by the name of David Watson. He exercised a very fruitful ministry. He was an international evangelist, well respected. During his last year, he lived and eventually died from cancer at the age of 50. In his last year, he writes about his experience in a book called Fear No Evil, the treatment that he endured and so on. And he recounts a time when, having completed a course of treatment at a hospital, he was sent home. And that same day, someone phoning a Bible college inquired after him. And he was told during the call that he had gone home. Well, it wasn't long before the rumour started to spread that David Watson had died. And if you've been in any evangelical church or connection for a long enough time, you'll understand exactly what happened. One person said he'd gone home, and the other took that to mean he'd gone home to be with the Lord. The same phrase is used, but it's understood in completely different ways. Well, here you have the same language, but with a different import. You have Judas handing over Jesus. You have the priests handing over Jesus. You have Pilate handing over Jesus. But now we have God handing over Jesus for us all. And the mystery deepens, because you'll remember the words of the institution that we repeat each time that we come to the Lord's table, which say, in the night in which he was betrayed, handed over, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23, Jesus took bread. It's the same verb. Well, who is the subject of the verb there in 1 Corinthians 11, 23? Quite literally, it is, in the same night in which he was handed over. Who's handing him over? Is it Judas? That's the way we usually take it. Or is it God? Well, we can continue to let it be Judas on that occasion, but exactly the same verb is used here now in Romans 8, 32. God handed him over for us all. And when you pull all that together, don't you see the mystery of God's ways? As one writer, Octavius Winslow, put it in the 19th century, who handed over Jesus to death? And he answers, not Judas for money, not Pilate for fear, not the Jews for envy, but God for love. You see, there's a mystery in these things, because you can see that Judas and the Jews and Pilate handed over Jesus to death, but really, behind it all, it is God who hands over Jesus for us. The mystery of God's ways. Now, your duty as a Christian is not to solve that mystery or to explain it. Your duty is rather to see the truth of it and to receive the truth of it. And you can see the truth of it, I hope, which is that men may do their worst. Men may plot and scheme and so on, but God is doing his work, even through it and often in spite of it. God is accomplishing his work, and we're to acknowledge the mystery of God's ways and even find some comfort from that for ourselves in our own situation in life. What we have here in Judas and the chief priests and Pilate and the people is an act, treacherous, unfaithful, diabolical act of infidelity. Wicked hands took and crucified the Prince of Life. And yet in that and through that, God was at work to redeem his people. And if that's true, can it not also be true that in your lesser circumstances, when you're overwhelmed with darkness and you can't see the way through and you can't figure out how you're going to hang on, and we can't see what God could possibly be doing in this terrible injustice that I'm suffering in life, could it not be true that the same God who through Jesus being handed over to his enemies, handed over his Son to redeem us, could it not be true that that God is working also in the mess of your life today? Redeeming and restoring and sanctifying you in those circumstances? That may be hard to see because of the mystery of God's ways, and by their very nature, mysteries can be difficult to fathom. And then thirdly, in this text this morning, we have the assurance of God's provision. The assurance of God's provision. Notice where Paul goes with this. He who did not spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? What Paul is arguing is this, that if in fact God has given all that he could give in giving his own Son, then is there any lesser need that you have that he cannot and will not supply? If he has given you his Son, what else would he bother withholding from you? If he has given Christ for you, will those lesser things be withheld? In his book, Knowing God, Jim Packer says that God will always give all that we need, and what he gives, whether material or spiritual, will always be enough for the present moment. That's what Paul is saying in this text. But then what does he mean when he says that God will freely, that is graciously, give us all things with Christ? What are the all things that God gives? Well, it certainly refers to what he says in verse 31, where he refers to these things. What then shall we say to these things? He means, when he says that, at least the things that he's already spoken about in Romans 8 so far. What things are they? Well, verse 1, acquittal in the face of condemnation. He gives that to you as a believer. What else? Verses 9 to 11, resurrection in the face of death. What else? Verses 12 to 17. Adoption in the face of fear. Adoption, that's God's word for his special childcare policy towards his people. Adoption in the face of fear. What else does he give? Verses 18 to 25. Hope in the face of distress and suffering. What else? Verse 26 and 27. Assistance in the face of frustration in prayer. What else? Verses 28 to 30. A certainty of complete transformation into the moral likeness of Jesus. So Paul says, what shall we say to these things? God is wholly for us. But it seems to me that the all things now in verse 32 embraces even more than the these things of verse 31. So we can say it embraces everything that he's already mentioned from verse 1, but then even more than that, his provision embraces all things, meaning all things that a believer can need. That is, I hasten to add, all things that God determines that a believer needs. What might those things be, the all things? Well, for one thing, it includes perseverance in the Christian life. Perseverance in the Christian life. You see, you might think that verse 32 is like one of these little spiritual morphine pills that deaden the pain while you're in church. But then after church, you've got to go out there and get on with it in the midst of all the crud and the muck of life, and the painkiller begins to wear off. Paul knows better than that. Paul wasn't burying his head in the sand when he wrote this, and he wasn't looking at life through rose-colored spectacles. How do I know that? Well, because of what he writes in verse 35 and 36, where he says, what shall separate us from the love of Christ? And he goes on to write the things that we meet along the path in the Christian life. What's that? And he tells us, tribulation, distress, persecution, hunger, nakedness, danger, sword. Paul's eyes are not closed to the realities of life when he writes verse 32. He knew what was on the road ahead of us, and he knows what's coming down the road to meet us. Verse 32, you see, isn't just a nice little verse for us to write on a plaque and to pin up on the wall at home. It's a declaration of the fact that certain difficulties that I will definitely meet, that there's an answer for them. There's a supply for them. It's a very sober, solemn truth. So take a long, hard look at verse 35 and the things that are going to come down the road to meet you, that will sift you and seek to separate you from the love of Christ. And when you think about those things, have you never asked yourself the question, how will I ever make it through to the end of the path? How will I ever endure all the way to glory? You look at the situation in your life, perhaps today, or one that you're going to meet in the future, and you ask, how am I going to hold up? How will I weather this storm that is coming into my life right now? What if my present comforts suddenly tumble in upon me? What if I lose all my resources? What if my health fails? And so on. What if I am confronted one day with persecution? Paul says, the God who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, has included in that gift all lesser gifts. How then will I endure? How will I make it through the mess that I'm in now and come out the other end still faithful to Jesus? How can I? Will I do that? Well, I'll do it because God, who did not spare his own son, but freely gave him up for us all in that greatest of gifts, has included all other gifts. So perseverance in the Christian life. And then we can also say provision of all my daily needs. That's also included in the all things, provision for your daily needs. You know, your daily bread, and so on. What God promises his people in Psalm 111, he provides food for those who fear him. He will always remember his covenant. The daily provision of basic stuff. And you know, I'm not talking about the health, wealth, prosperity preachers on the television or on your computer. It's not that God provides to you a certain standard of living or anything like that, but the all things includes all that you need to sustain the life you have for as long as God calls you to live for his glory here. Daily provision. There was once a man called John Murray, lived way up in the northeast of Scotland in the mid-18th century. And at one point in his life, there was a whole series of poor harvests, and life was a real struggle. And one day, a relative of his went to visit him and was there for the midday meal, which was, as usual, just potatoes and salt. And his relative commiserated with him because the potatoes were so poor. And John Murray said this: "There's not one of them upon which I do not see the beauty of the blood. There's not one of them upon which I do not see the beauty of the blood." What on earth does that mean? It means this, that John Murray believed that when God did not spare his own son, but gave him up, handed him over for us all, he gave us the greatest riches we could ever want. And he will then never be deficient in supplying our daily needs, even if he has to use poor potatoes to sustain us. That's why John Murray saw on those potatoes the beauty of the blood. They were purchased possessions of the God who had given up his son for us. And what about you? Most of you today are going to be able to walk away from this service when it's over. Most of you will have transportation from here to your home or wherever. Most of you have a place to stay tonight where you'll have shelter and warmth. Most of you are going to have something to eat at lunchtime. Well, that largely takes care of today, doesn't it? God did not spare his only son, and with him he has given you part of the all things that you need today. Paul says God did not spare even his own son. And you have to draw a certain implication from that and say, therefore, I shall lack nothing.